I'd like to speak to you tonight about Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was a true, real figure of history. It's sometimes good to remind ourselves that, as we were looking at a few weeks ago, we don't follow cunningly devised fables, as Peter put it in his second letter. Instead, we are followers of a true story which concerned real people of history. And Pontius Pilate was one such figure. He ruled, or was prefect at least, of Judea from around 26 AD to 36 AD. And numerous ancient texts give us information about him. Philo, Tacitus, Josephus, all these historians of various sort speak of him. Philo describes Pontius Pilate as a man of a very inflexible disposition and very merciless as well as very obstinate, and that he had a habit of insulting others cruelly and murdering people untried and uncondemned. Pilate's cruelty is confirmed by Luke, the gospel writer Luke, who gives an account of Pilate mixing the blood of some Galileans with their sacrifices. And, such is the known history of Pilate. But what I want to look at tonight is not so much the biography of Pontius Pilate, but see what we can learn from when Pontius Pilate was faced with a much more important man of history, the Lord Jesus Christ himself. Because Pontius Pilate had a unique privilege, or at least it should have been a privilege, to see Jesus face to face. And we've just read the account of what Pontius Pilate did when he was faced with Jesus Christ in the flesh. And in many ways, that's kind of a theme of John's Gospel. Those who have been with us throughout this series, we've seen various characters and how they have responded to Jesus. John opens his Gospel saying that Jesus was like and is like a light shining in darkness. He came down into this world to reveal who God is. He came into this dark world and shone like a light. In John chapter 8, we even read that Jesus is the light of the world. But in many ways, John's Gospel is about how human beings responded to that light, and also how people still respond to that light even today, even though Jesus is no longer here on earth. And Pilate is a unique individual in that regard because he wasn't religious. Most of the people we've read about in John's Gospel up to this point have been Jewish people with a religious history and a religious interest, if you like. And they already knew something of the scriptures and of what God had done in the past. But Pontius Pilate was a Gentile. He was a Roman prefect, a Roman governor. He had no interest, and if you were here just a few weeks ago when we were reading at the first part of this trial, it becomes very obvious that Pilate has no interest in the Jewish traditions and fables as he sees them. And yet, Jesus appears to Pontius Pilate as well. And Pontius Pilate, this Roman Gentile, is given the opportunity to respond to the light of the world. And what I want to do is just look briefly at just 3 observations about Pontius Pilate from this passage and see what we today can learn of it for ourselves. So the first thing I want to just point out is Pilate knew the truth. Pilate knew the truth. Jesus has been standing before Pontius Pilate in this trial. He's been brought to Pontius Pilate by the Jewish leaders who are jealous of him and want to see him dead. And they have brought Jesus to Pontius Pilate because only Pontius Pilate has the authority to deal out the death sentence. The Jewish leaders don't have that authority. But three times in this passage, or the first one is just outside this passage, Pilate says that Jesus is innocent. You can see the first time in John 18, verse 38, we read that Pontius Pilate went out to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault in him at all." That's the first time. Then in John 19:4, in the passage we read earlier, it says, "Pilate then went out again and said to them, 'Behold, I'm bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him.'" Then again, just a couple of verses later in verse 6, Pilate says, at the end of verse 6, Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." Three times, Pontius Pilate affirms that Jesus is innocent. He can find nothing wrong with Jesus, let alone anything worthy of death. So Pilate had no doubt about Jesus' innocence. There's an important lesson in there, by the way. Sometimes we can think that if only we could give someone a better argument about the truth of Christianity or the truth of who Jesus is, if we could just perhaps read some clincher argument, then they would be persuaded, perhaps a loved one or a friend or a neighbor. And we think if only we could just give them that argument, then they would understand. Then they would accept the truth. But if John's gospel teaches us anything, it teaches us that people's opposition to Jesus is not merely or chiefly simply an intellectual one. We need to beware making the mistake of thinking that everyone would accept Jesus if only they could be intellectually persuaded of the truth of his claims. There are deeper things going on in people's hearts. I heard a story about an experienced bridge engineer who was overseeing the final inspection of an important bridge. And on paper, everything looked acceptable, but one test result showed the concrete hadn't fully set or not set in the right way. And the engineer knew that the bridge needed a few more weeks. But the pressure on this engineer was intense. The city council wanted it to be opened before the election. The construction company warned him that delays would cost jobs, and his own promotion was under threat. The engineer knew that the bridge needed a few more weeks, but all these other pressures mounted on him, and he signed off the bridge. Well, the bridge didn't collapse immediately. For months, nothing happened, but after a winter freeze, a structural fault appeared, and that forced an emergency closure. When asked later why he signed the report, the engineer said, "I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't." Do you see, the issue wasn't an intellectual one. He was already convinced in his mind. The issue was in his heart. It was what he was afraid would happen if he acted on what he knew in his mind. And that's exactly the problem here with Pontius Pilate. He knew Jesus was innocent. He knew what he should do. He's the prefect. He had the authority of life and death. He knew there was nothing he could find wrong with Jesus, so his decision should be obvious and clear. But there were other pressures on Pontius Pilate. What did Pontius Pilate fear? That engineer in that story feared the possible loss of jobs and the pressure from the council, etc. But what did Pontius Pilate fear? Well, you can see it hinted at in verse 12. It says, "From then on Pilate sought to release Jesus. But the Jews cried out, saying, 'If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar.'" You see Pilate's problem. Pilate is afraid that if he lets Jesus go, these crowds, led by the Jewish religious leaders, they're going to be very angry because they want Jesus dead. And they're claiming that Jesus has claimed to be a king. And as they say to Pilate, whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. And Pilate's afraid that if this news gets to Caesar, and there are riots and there's upheaval in Judea on account of this man Jesus, then Pilate's afraid that his job, or perhaps even his life, will be on the line because it's his job to keep the peace in Judea. He knew what the right thing to do was intellectually, but he was afraid of losing his job. He was afraid of losing his life. He was afraid of the consequences of doing what he knew to be right. But you get another sense of the conflict that's going on in Pilate's heart a little bit earlier. Look at verse 6 again, when Pilate says to the people, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." Then look at verse 8. "Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid." That's interesting. Why was Pilate even more afraid when the Jews told him that Jesus made himself to be the Son of God? It's possible that something of what was going on in Pilate's heart was when he hears that phrase, Son of God, he thinks of the Roman emperors who also claimed to be God and sons of God. And perhaps in that phrase he saw in these words Jesus claiming to be a rival to the emperor. But I'm not sure that's actually what made Pilate afraid in this instance, because if that alone was what made Pilate more afraid here, then why then talk to Jesus in verse 9? He goes into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" The reason I think Pilate asks that question is because his fear is deeper. At this point, he's not merely afraid of losing his life and losing his job. It seems in the mind of Pilate, he's perhaps a little afraid, perhaps superstitiously afraid. What if this Jesus really is who he's saying he is? What if this Jesus truly is the Son of God, and I sentence him to death, and I send him to be crucified? Perhaps that's why he then goes to Jesus and says, "Where are you from?" Pilate is deeply conflicted. On the one hand, he's in danger of losing his job and perhaps his life. But now, on the other hand, he's afraid maybe he's going to lose his soul itself. And he doesn't know what to do. And he, in desperation, goes to Jesus and asks him where he is from. But what does it say next? End of verse 9. but Jesus gave him no answer. Jesus gave him no answer. Why didn't Jesus answer Pilate? The reason is because Pilate already knew everything he needed to know. There was nothing more Pilate needed. 3 times now he said that Jesus is innocent. Pilate's path is clear. What he should do is obvious. He should release Jesus. Again, the problem isn't that Pilate needs more information. This question asked of Jesus is irrelevant. Pilate already knows everything that he should do. So Jesus gives him no answer. Just a little point of application for us. Sometimes people can have all sorts of excuses for not doing as the Bible teaches, or not doing what God says, or even not doing what their conscience is telling them is right. And they'll often come up with all sorts of reasons why they don't. And they say, well, if God shows me a miracle, if he shows himself to me, if he does this, if he does that, then I will do it. Then I will believe, or then I will obey. And people make these tests, as it were, for God. But God, as it were, says to them, you already know everything you need to know. When human beings do that, when we do that, we're simply playing games with God. God has given us everything we need to know. The book of Psalms says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. We know God exists. We know this world didn't just come out of nowhere for nothing. We know it didn't just pop out of nowhere. It has been designed for a purpose. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And we know from the teachings of Christ that his teaching is good, that it is healthy, that it is profitable. We can read of Jesus' life and his death, and we can study it and analyze it and examine it for ourselves. We have everything we need to decide to follow him. When we put obstacles in the way, when we test God, when we ask him to do more, we're merely revealing our sinful hearts, that we don't want to do what God wants us to do. And that's what's happening here with Pilate. Pilate doesn't want to do what he knows is right because he's afraid of the consequences. And it can be the same for us. We can avoid doing what we know to be right simply because we are afraid of the consequences. Sadly, Pilate tries to play it both ways. He's afraid of losing his job or his life. He's afraid of losing his soul. So what he does, he tries to take a middle course. He tries to play it on both hands. And did you notice that in verse 6? It said, Pilate said to them, you take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. In other Gospels, we're told that he washed his hands in front of the Jewish crowds. And he said, I wash my hands of this man. In other words, what he's trying to do is saying, it's nothing to do with me. It's not my decision. If you want to crucify him, you crucify him, but I'm staying out of it. Pilate tries to rid himself of the responsibility. And again, many people do that today. Many people try to sit on the fence where Jesus is concerned. They say, well, I'm not going to reject him, but I'm not going to follow him either. I'm just going to kind of try and sit in the middle and try and play on both sides. But what did Jesus say? He said, you're either for me or against me. You cannot serve both God and man. To make no choice is to make a choice. It's a choice to reject Christ. And that, sadly, is what Pilate does here. By making no choice, he sends an innocent man to his death. Pilate had the authority. Pilate had the opportunity to release Jesus, but his fear led him to send an innocent man to the cross. But did you notice what Jesus said in this passage? The one time Jesus speaks in the passage that we read, he refuses to answer Pilate's question, but in verse 10, Pilate asks him another question. It says, "Then Pilate said to him, 'Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?' But listen to Jesus' response. He said, 'You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin.'" Jesus says to Pilate that what he's wanting to do in sending Jesus to the cross is a sin, it's wrong, but there are others with greater sin. Jesus actually tells Pilate that Pilate's guilt is less than the guilt of Judas, who betrayed Jesus, and the guilt of the chief priests who brought Jesus to Pilate. You might say, well, how is that so? Surely it's all the same. The Judas and the priests and Pilate are all sentencing Jesus to death. But what Jesus is saying is that Pilate, in a sense, is in an unfortunate situation. He's only there because he's been put there as the Roman prefect. He's got nothing against Jesus. He didn't choose to judge this case. He's got no hatred or envy or jealousy of Jesus. He's just been handed this situation because of the jealousy and envy of the high priest and his followers. Pilate's got no personal animosity towards Jesus. He's only there because he is the Roman prefect, and he's the one who happened to be there when the Jewish leaders brought Jesus to him. That's what Jesus means when he says, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above." The Bible teaches that all rulers, whoever they are, whether they're counselors or kings or prime ministers or presidents, they are ultimately put in place by God. It's God's will that they be there. And Pilate, in essence, says to Pilate, the only reason you're here is because you've been put here by God. Not so with Judas. Not so with the chief priests. They're here because of envy and jealousy and hatred and murder in their hearts. You're here because you've been appointed to be here. For that reason, your sin is lesser. But notice, he doesn't say your sin is non-existent. Pilate still has a responsibility here. Pilate still has a responsibility to do what is right, though his guilt is not as great as the chief priests and Judas himself. But did you notice the interesting response that Pilate has to these words of Jesus in verse 12? It says, "From then on, Pilate sought to release him." Jesus tells him and says, there are others who have a greater sin than you. And you might think that would kind of cause Pilate to relax a bit and say, oh, well, it's not too bad then. I can send this man to his death, and there's other people who bear greater responsibility. But instead, it's the opposite. It says in verse 12 that from then on, Pilate sought all the more to release Jesus. His conscience seems to be winning. His sense of right and wrong seems to be strengthened, and he wants to release Jesus. But sadly, the Jews the Jewish leaders know how to push Pilate's buttons. And in verse 12, they say, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." And we read in verse 13, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew Gabbatha. And he says in the end, verse 16, he delivers Jesus to be crucified. He makes his choice. His soul, as it were, is teetering on the knife edge, but his fears for his life and his job in the end win the day, and he delivers Jesus to be crucified. He thought he was washing his hands of it, but his choice was just that. It was a choice. Pilate was like someone who leaves a bill unopened on the doormat. Have you ever done that? You know what the letter is in your heart, but you don't want to open it because you don't want to know what it is. You just leave it on the side and hope it goes away. Or like when you see someone out the corner of your eye in the street and you don't want to interact with them, so you sort of pass over and don't see them. Or when you hear the telephone ringing and you suspect you know who it is, so you just let it run. Or you're like Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen, who put a telescope to his blind eye and said, "I see no ships." You heard that story. It's ignorance, but it's willful ignorance. That's what Pilate is doing here. He is putting his fingers in his ears saying, "I can't hear you," when he can. That's what so many people do today. That's what so many people do with God's word. He shouts to them in creation. He shouts to them through his word. He shouts to them through the life of Jesus Christ that we can read in the Gospels and that Pilate himself could see with his own eyes and hear with his own ears. But Pilate shut his eyes to it, and people do the same today. And they make all sorts of excuses why it doesn't apply to them. But they're as responsible as Pilate was here. It's interesting, I heard a story, and I'm not quite sure if it's true or not, but there are reports apparently that when Adolf Hitler was 4 years old, he fell into an icy river while playing, and a local youth, don't seem to know his name, some say he was the son of a family living nearby, pulled him out and saved him from drowning. You might look back on that with hindsight and say that was the worst thing that youth ever did. He saved Hitler's life when Hitler was 4 years old. But here's the question. Was that youth responsible for all that Hitler did afterwards? Of course not. But what he was responsible for was saving that little 4-year-old boy's life. And there's a lesson in there for us. You could say that Pontius Pilate's acts here ultimately led to the salvation of the world, because Pilate delivers Jesus to be crucified, and then Jesus is crucified on the cross, and he dies for the sins of all who would trust in him. But that doesn't take away the fact that Pilate had a responsibility here. He had a responsibility to do what is right. That's the lesson for us as well. God is able to work good out of evil. He is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. But that's not our business. That's not ours to worry about. What we need to worry about is doing what is right with what God has given us today. Our job is to respond to whatever light we have now. Pilate was given light. He saw Jesus. He spoke to Jesus. He knew Jesus was innocent, and he had everything he needed to let Jesus go. But in cowardice and fear, he sent him to the cross. And likewise, we today, perhaps people here in this congregation or people watching online, God has given us everything we need to respond to his call, to respond to his commands. And what we're faced with is the choice whether we will respond like Pilate or whether we will respond with honesty and with truth. There were people in this situation who did just that. I'm not quite sure if it's in John's Gospel, but it's at least in one of the other Gospels. I think it might be in John's Gospel. We learn of Joseph of Arimathea, and we learn of Nicodemus. And both these men, we're told, did not consent to the death of Christ. They were on the Sanhedrin, it seems, or at least they were high up in the Jewish leadership. And we're told they did not consent to Jesus' death. When there was a vote, if there was a vote, they voted against sending Jesus to death. Now, obviously, you could say it did no good. Jesus went to the cross anyway. But they did what was right in the situation they were in. They were given the light they were given, and they responded in the right way. Pilate did the opposite. He turned away from the light that shone in his face. So the question is to us as well. What will we do with the light that is given to us? Do we hear God's word? And do we harden our hearts? Do we say, oh, it's not for me. I need to hear more. I need this. I need that. I need the other. Or do we, in humility and in a genuine desire to listen to what God has to say, do we say, what do you want? What do you want me to do? That's really the test of our hearts. That test, that is really the way we know whether we are of the truth or whether we are not. In the next few weeks, we're going to continue looking at this account of the crucifixion, and we'll see those two sets of people demonstrated in the crucifixion itself, but also in the days following. But for now, let's just ask that question of ourselves. Who are we most like? Are we most like Joseph of Arimathea, of Nicodemus? Or are we like Pontius Pilate, dodging the truth when we hear it? And with those thoughts in mind, I've chosen as our final hymn number 706. 706 in the hymn book. And it's really a prayer to God to ask him to help us answer that question for ourselves. 706, search me, O God, my actions try, and let my life appear, as seen by thine all-searching eye, to mine my ways make clear. So let's close by singing 706.